Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our special event tonight with Andrew Fleming, and a special welcome to all of the Coldstream Hills Amphitheatre members who are tuning in this evening, and of course all our Coldstream Hill lovers around the world. And I say that because I know a couple of people in the UK are tuning in. Andrew, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, George, and thanks for having me, and also thanks for everybody for tuning in tonight, club members and others. Really appreciate it.
And this is a special time for us every year, and this year a little bit more special as we celebrate 35 years of Coldstream Hills, albeit we would have loved to have done this in person. Andrew, have you celebrated the year all year? Have you and Halliday been celebrating every night?
Well, sadly, we haven't been able to do much at all. We are 200 metres away from one another when I'm at work, so I guess that's socially distant. And about phone calls, that's really it. It's been, you know, as any of us that are in lockdown or have experienced, you know, what we're going through at the moment, it's been the weirdest year. You know, it doesn't seem that long ago that, you know, we were thinking about the dread of bushfires and things in Gippsland and throughout the northeastern part of Victoria. That just seems like a distant memory compared to, you know, what we've been doing the last 6 months or thereabouts. But at least, you know, the signs are positive. And, you know, unfortunately, we can't be celebrating having a dinner as we have done in most years, but we've got some nice pizzas that have just been delivered, and we'll enjoy them with our wines.
Right. And just reminding everyone, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If there's any questions you'd like to ask Andrew, I can pass them through to him. And before we kick off we're going to focus on 4 of the new release wines, but also talk about a few others because it's a great release this year. But you mentioned James Halliday, and he lives 200 metres away there, so he's still on the property. Many of us have seen him in the press recently, and he's been selling off some of his wine collection. Can you explain, maybe for those that are relatively new to Coldstream Hills, the relationship of James still living on the property and how important that is?
Oh, it's immense. I mean, if you talk to him, he says that Coldstream Hills just runs through his veins. You know, he's still a kid in a lolly shop when he sees the new vintage wines. It's something that's really special to him. And, you know, in a somewhat morbid way, he says that when his time is up with whatever being there is in the sky, he will remain part of a house block vineyard just in front. And as he said, that his ashes will be abusing any winemaker that makes the wrong decision when it comes to harvest times and so forth. So there is that constant threat that he will be round for forever and a day. But I think interestingly, just in a recent article, he was reviewing, or just by surprise with the emptying out of his wine cellar, selling off quite a lot, as people know, but he managed to find a couple of bottles of 1987 Miller's Vineyard Pinot from Coldstream Hills. So that was one of the first wines that he made, and opened it with great delight, just seeing how good the wine looked. And so Miller's Vineyard was the old, or is what is now the de Bortley's Vineyard, but it did highlight to him then and to us now, well and truly, that these wines will age incredibly well. And back in those days, you know, Pinot was often only 11.5 or 12% alcohol. It was almost made in the, not quite the hunter style of, you know, Semillon, picking it early, but it was, you know, the early picking just meant that the acid was fresh, and these wines have lasted particularly well. And as he says, fortunately to have a really good cork that season.
So when he decided on the Yarra Valley in the 80s, obviously the industry had been around for a long time. Obviously we go back to the 1860s and then the rebirth really in the 1960s. He chose it obviously for Pinot and Chardonnay, but he must have been confident also that it was a region that would give wines that would age well. Is he now happy that he's vindicated when he sees those old wines?
Oh, absolutely. If you ask him what his favourite vintage is, more than likely he'll say 1992, and that's seeing how that vintage looks now. It's incredible. You know, we're fortunate that we've got a few magnums of 92 Reserve Cabernet, Reserve Pinot, and so forth, and they still show remarkably well. And over the years, for some of the dinners that we've had, we've bought those wines out. And to me, it's always it's a treat, because it really does show the pedigree of the region, that these wines, they're very much medium-bodied styles, as we know, but they will last incredibly well. And now, ever since 2003, we've been using screw cap. And of course, that just, for me, when it comes to writing peak drinking times, it's very difficult, because the sky's the limit in a lot of these cases. And that's reinforced when we line up vertical vintages, whether it be Chardonnay, Pinot, since those days, and just how even the wine looks. You can see the vintage variation, you can see the gradual maturation of the wine, but it's just this wonderful reward to see not only what screw cap does, but the combination of good fruit, a great vintage, and hopefully some pretty decent winemaking along the way.
So if we look at the Coldstream Hills and the Yarra Valley, we're now looking at a lot of vineyards that have got decades of history behind them, don't we? So it's not a young area anymore, is it?
Oh no, definitely. And I think a lot of people, when they look at quality wines, one of the things they often consider is what's the age of the vines. If you're dealing with young vineyards, they're wines that are, they're vibrant, they're fresh, but may not have the depth and structure of properly mature vines. I mean, you go to Burgundy or other parts of France, and they always talk about mature vines being sort of 40 years old or thereabouts. And I think you just get that opportunity, or the vines get that opportunity to sink their roots right down into the soil, and they seem to be able to, bear the extremes of whether it be weather events or whatever, just that little bit better. And I guess from a winemaking perspective, we just see that consistency coming through from year to year. So vine age is super important, and that definitely is a reflection of a region really evolving and finding its identity. And then, the smart thing also is to work out what you plant, where you plant, how you plant it. And these days, a lot more interest in, particular, whether we talk about clones or anything like that, but there's a lot of parameters that are at play that really, they're the tricks in our bag to try and come up with something that's really particularly interesting. The only thing that's, I suppose, the downside is that any change you make, whether it be new planting or whatever, it takes, 10 years before realistically you're starting to get to the quality and level that you would expect. So it's anyone that's in this game is in it for the long term.
Yeah, it's interesting. Before we get to the wine, so you made a point there, begs me to ask a question. So if we look back at the 70s and 80s, when the Yarra Valley really kicked off to be one of the preeminent areas in Australia now, percentage of plantings that were done properly, right clones, right varieties, right aspects, what would you say is a total valley, the percentage that got it right were?
I suppose everybody would no doubt have a different answer, but I'd like to think, say if I speak about Coldstream Hills to start with, I think somewhere near the mark. There was some Sauv Blanc that was planted, perhaps that wasn't necessarily needed. The challenge, I think, to the Yarra, not only for Coldstream Hills, for other producers, was that if you ordered, Pinot Noir, for example, the material that you got in was, as we see in the vineyard, it is a mixture of clones. You see that there are vines that look quite different to others. And, whereas these days, you want to be much more precise in what you want to order. I mean, you may design to have a selection of different plants throughout a block, but, in our Pinot, occasionally we'll see Shiraz, or you'll see some white grapes coming through. I mean, they're anomalies, of course, but I think the level of control that we have is so much better now. And that comes, that whole quality, right from the nurseries right through to planting, and then ultimately making what we do. So I think, in the main, the Yarra got it pretty close to right. It's just dealing with what we had to play with. And I think when I see now some of the old vineyards that are planted, varieties like Cabernet and Shiraz, they're later maturing varieties. So you have to be pretty careful how you plant those. You know, you plant them on slopes or aspects where you are going to maximise sunlight. Because, you know, they need that sunlight to get the colour, flavour, extraction, all those sort of things that you expect in a medium-bodied, late maturing style, whereas something like sparkling is quite the opposite, where you're not looking for colour or you're not necessarily looking for oodles of flavour. So you tend to find south-facing slopes, so there's a little more shade perhaps, and that's there for acid retention. So it really is a horses for courses thing. And of course, what's going to happen in the future with, you know, we're seeing this trend of warming. We may see other varieties, you know, Mediterranean varieties, who knows? There's always an element of that. And I think the late Bailey Carados from Yarra Yering was quite an explorer in that regard with a number of, you know, the Portuguese varieties that he planted, which, you know, back in 1969 when he started was really quite revolutionary. Some people might have thought he was mad, but others would have said, hey, you've done pretty well.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, when we look at people like him and obviously James, the visionaries. Let's get into the wines. And as I said, the release this time of year is always eagerly anticipated by all of us. We've chosen 2 Pinot Noirs and 2 Chardonnays, and we'll talk about those. There's some other great wines, and I want to just talk briefly for 1 minute about the sparkling, which I think for you, and when we talk about you, it's Pinot and Chardonnay, one of the greatest winemakers in Australia with those 2 varieties. But that sparkling that you release, not every year, but when you release it, if you look at the wine show history, it's quite incredible, isn't it?
Oh, it's a ripping wine, I think, and that's not being totally biased or
You're allowed to be.
Okay, or exaggerating too much, but it has done remarkably well in the shows really since probably 2011 onwards. Occasionally in exceptional vintages, we bring out a Blanc de Blanc. So we did that in 2011 vintage. And then as well as the 2015 Pinot Chardonnay Sparkling, which is from a fantastic vintage. And you know, I had a look at it a little while ago and it's just so fresh and lively. And that's something that the Yarra, as I've said before, does particularly well. These wines just retain incredible freshness with complexity, and as an aperitif style, I think it's a lovely wine. So watch this space. In a couple of months, there'll be a 2015 Blanc de Blanc being released as well, which I'm quite excited about. Very small make, but that's really what Coldstream Hills is all about. If we find small parcels of fruit that we think are particularly special and worth taking right through to the end, then we do so. And that's very much the philosophy of our single vineyard program and also our reserve wines.
Great. So we move to Chardonnays now, and you've chosen 2 to talk about tonight of the new releases. And the first one is the Deer Farm. Tell us a little bit about the Deer Farm vineyard firstly before we get to this specific vintage.
Okay, the Deer Farm vineyard is located in Gladysdale, which is 30 kilometres from where Coldstream Hills is. So it's very much at the southeastern end of the Yarra Valley. It's notably cooler. It's a little more elevated. Soils are a little different to, say, where the winery is, where you have more of the grey clay loams around Coldstream Hills, but up towards the Upper Yarra, you have a mixture of those sort of clay duplex soils, but also the red loamy soils. So it's more that youthful mountainous soil. And viticulturally, it's much more of a challenging area because it notably has anywhere up to double the rainfall, which is incredible. That, you know, you think of the Yarra Valley as, you know, as a reasonably large area without being over the top, yet you do see quite significant differences in weather patterns. And that's the beauty of what the Yarra does, because we can produce wines from the same variety, which will show different characters across the region. So Gladysdale, cooler, a little more elevated. The wines are generally very refined, elegant in style, with great length of flavour. And that's that's really what the Yarra aspires to: elegance, finesse, and length of flavour. They're the key ones. And ultimately, you add all those things up, and they become very food-friendly wines.
So when you choose your single vineyard collection, it seems like there are consistent vineyards, this being one of them. Are there years where others poke out and you think sometimes I wouldn't mind releasing that as a single vintage? I'm talking now specifically about Chardonnay.
Yeah, from time to time. Look, I know, say with Deer Farm, it's quite a big vineyard. So there are a couple of blocks that we have the option to play with. Most years it's normally one block, which is interestingly a south-facing block. When I was talking about sparkling before, warmer conditions, this wine works particularly well from a south-facing block. But there are one or two other blocks on the vineyard that from time to time just show up for whatever reason. I mean, that's the I suppose the exciting part of winemaking. It's not an exact science. There are always surprises that come up, and ultimately the blend is really what it's all about, making sure that it shows the expression from that particular site, and it gives, you know, people the opportunity to see that there are changes from year to year, but at the same time you can still see that core thread that goes through that wine. So for something like Deer Farm Chardonnay, it's very much about citrus, sort of lemon curd fruit characters. The warmer years, you'll see almost those white daisy flowers coming through, occasional stone fruit. But it's that purity and length of flavour and that really juicy sort of citrus acidity that really is a hallmark of Deer Farm. And, you know, aromatically, it's quite subtle. In some years, it can almost not quite look Riesling-like, but it just has these beautiful aromatics that come through. But if you look at the cooler years of, say, 2015, 17, and what you'll eventually see out of 2020, alongside the warmer years, you'll still see there's that thread that goes through. In the warmer years, perhaps a little more generosity to begin with, but the cooler years, they're very much those wines that are sleepers and really do reward well.
White daisy fruit, flowers, I've written that down. You should be writing Hallmark gift cards with technology, like with terms like that. You just talked about vintages, Andrew. There's been a lot of commentary about 2019, but to be fair, most of it's been from South Australian winemakers. What's your view on 19 vintage? Because we've got a few of them tonight.
It was not the easiest vintage by any stretch. I mean, I'll just flip back 1 second to say 2011 as a vintage. A lot of people wrote that off completely, and as winemakers in the Yarra, we were getting really jacked off because it was probably the best Chardonnay we've ever made, to try and get that message out. So for 2019, you can sum it up as being a great start to the season with lovely spring rains and so forth. And then it was as though there was just a click of the switch and rain stopped. We had pretty intense heat over January. I think from memory, something like 6 degrees above average for January against long-term averages. And then for February and March, 2 to 3 degrees above what the long-term average is. So that poses a challenge to us as winemakers because you throw in there that it didn't rain really at all. So, you know, we were reliant on irrigation. We had to keep the vines alive. But the key, I suppose, for most winemakers that year was that it was about picking the flavours when they were right. And the good thing was that often with warmer seasons, the flavours will kick in a little earlier. So you're not going to see big heady alcohol wines, certainly in Chardonnay, because that's the last thing we want. It's all about balance. So it's that, you know, going back to those three things of elegance, finesse, length of flavour. And I think the interesting thing that comes through in those Chardonnays is when you look at them, is they actually look as though they're from a cooler year than a warmer year. So there's not that abundance of stone fruit or anything like that. There's that lemon curd citrus note that comes through, that finesse of acidity and balance. And then I think also is that the oak that we use is always quite subtle, but you find that these wines, they are cool climate in nature, albeit we've said it's a warm season, but they just have this innate power to absorb oak. They just have layers of flavour, and that's the thing that really is enticing about the Yarra Valley. And, as we know, the Yarra over the last however many years has really gained a very strong reputation for Chardonnay. I mean, Pinot obviously as well. And others, if you spoke to around the valley, would say, well, what about Cabernet? What about Shiraz and everything else? Often that'll end up in a fight if we ask what are the leading varieties in the Yarra. But we're talking about Pinot and Chardonnay tonight. And Chardonnay works well no matter what conditions. As long as you look after the vines and you respect the winemaking and the viticulture, you get some pretty good results.
It's interesting you mentioned the vintage differences. If you gave me that glass of wine blind, I wouldn't have picked it from a warmer vintage, because your warmer vintages are, of course, still relatively cool to other parts. And you bang on, and those at home aren't necessarily trying this wine in front of them. But I urge you, if you're into pristine, modern, classic Australian Chardonnay, this is a ripper. It's got that fine edge all the way through. Next year, Andrew, you celebrate your 20th vintage at Coldstream Hills. Congratulations. Obviously, you started when you were 18. How's your view on Chardonnay changed in 20 years from the first day you walked in there and Halliday and you sat across the blending table? What's changed in your view with Chardonnay in that time?
Well, I guess the first time it was yes, sir, yes, sir. That's and just learn. I think when people talk about Chardonnay, it's evolution, not revolution. That's one of the buzzwords that's used. And then I think the changes that we've made at Coldstream Hills over that journey. We've been smarter in the oak that we use. I think James Halliday always had it pretty well right with respecting the fruit flavours, because fruit was first and foremost. So subtle with oak, the type of oak that we use. A lot of for the single vineyards and reserves is about the larger format oak. So if you think purely of surface area to volume ratio, the oak character is a little more subtle, but at the same time, you just get this supporting texture that comes through. Other things, I think in the vineyard, we've learned a hell of a lot more in ensuring that we get the best out of our vines. It might be when we talk about the 1%ers, it might be as simple as micronutrients that just make all that difference when it comes to fruit set and so forth. Other things which are big, I think, with these warmer seasons that we've seen progressively over the last 10 to 15 years, in the early days, the acids would be quite high and malolactic fermentation to soften that acidity. And, ultimately you end up with those creamier style wines with softer acidity. That's something that really I haven't pushed at all. I know when I started at Coldstream Hills, James would always talk about, say, 20% of the wine would go through malolactic. For probably 19 years, none has, or as close to none has. And it's really just about keeping that freshness of line. And with these warmer seasons that we've had over the last 10 years, admittedly we've had cool ones as well, but those warm ones, you get the soft acidity. So you don't actually need to deacidify through a malolactic fermentation, because all you're going to do, if you do that, then you're just going to most likely add acid back. And I think that's a retrograde step. If you can do as little as you possibly can, I think it bodes better for the wine when it comes to not only how it looks as a young wine, but also for that ageability.
So zero malo in that 19, do you find?
No malolactic at all. So it's interesting because for dinners and functions and tastings, people have often thought that it had malo, particularly a wine that's, 1 or 2 years old, because it does develop that, creaminess, not that creme brulee sort of creaminess, but it's just that sort of textural creaminess. And we often find that one of the oak types that we use just seems to give that real textural component. You get that nice sort of edge of graphite match flint, you know, gun flint that comes through at times, but also you just get this textural feel as well, which I think is really good. So, you know, we've tweaked with a couple of different barrel producers as well. And that's always an interesting tasting, because we line up a batch of juice that's gone through every different barrel type that we've used for the vintage, and then we taste those wines later on in the track. So it's a bit of a report card for any of our oak suppliers that come through. If they say, well, look, you know, my oak is the best in the universe, and you say, well, come and have a look at this, we don't think it is, or yes, we tend to agree with you. Now the scale is very, very defined, and what that's telling us is that we're pretty happy with the quality of oak that we're using. But ultimately, the most important thing is getting it right in the vineyard.
Yeah. So we move to the Reserve Chardonnay, and for those on the call, many I've met, and there's a couple of questions which I'll get to in a minute from some old mates that I've known for a while, enjoying great wines. But if you look at Chardonnay in Australia, it's certainly my variety of choice. And if I look at the best Chardonnays in the country, if I look at the show records in the last 10 years, probably Kim Schroeder with Reserve Bin at Penfolds and Andrew Fleming with Reserve have probably dominated all of the accolades. You're the king of Chardonnay in my eyes, Andrew. You obviously got an eye for it and a palate for it. You've got some great vineyards, but this Reserve continuously just does an amazing job to show what Australia does well. Why is it always such a good wine? Is it because you don't release a lot of it and not all the time?
Well, I'll go back to the start. It's very much a team effort, so remember that.
Come on, mate. Pump up your tyres a little bit. It's okay. It's in a sanctum. It's the family now. It's okay.
But I think we know when we make a good meal, you've got to have good ingredients to start. Yeah. So that's right. It's not all about the spices and pepper and salt. But going right back to the start, you know, they're mature vines, so that generally helps. Definitely, it helps. Reserve Chardonnay is pretty. We know it works well in the Yarra. I find that really out of 10 years, probably 8 out of 10 years, we'll end up with a Reserve Chardonnay, whereas Pinot, it's probably more like 6 out of 10 years we'll get a Reserve Pinot. But Chardonnay, for us, for Reserve, comes from 3 main blocks. This particular vintage, it's only from 2 of those blocks. The interesting thing about those blocks is one is house blocks, so James's favourite block and not yet his resting place. And there's another vineyard that we have called the Bryanston Vineyard, which has some wonderful Burgundian clones, which produce very fine aromatic wines. And so you combine that with what's at the estate from either house block, or we have another block adjacent to that when we use that as well. That really provides the power. And Reserve to us, if people were able to see both Deer Farm and Reserve alongside each other, they'd see the finesse of Deer Farm, and then they'd see the sort of power and structure of Reserve. It's got more of that pithiness, the slate, the mineral, length of flavour. And I know that, you know, seeing this wine 10 or 15 years down the track, it really will show the benefits not only of aging, but it will have developed other complexing factors, but it will still show that vibrancy and freshness of fruit that it has right from the word go, which is always a treat and a delight when we see these old wines.
Consistency of vineyards that go into Reserve? Is it the same vineyards most years?
Pretty much. We keep all the parcels separate.
Yep.
And then, you know, what I often say, it's not work, it's just playtime or joy. It's just line up all the barrels and puncheons that we think have potential, and then decide on what we think is of Reserve standard, put together a blend on the bench. And if it sort of ticks the boxes, or as we often say, if James is around, if it sends his eyebrows sufficiently north, then, you know, we're onto a pretty good thing. And then You know, sometimes it's really easy. If you get a year like 2011 or 2015 or 17, or I think 2020 is going to be pretty smart. But equally, you know, these warmer seasons, it really is a testament of good viticulture, some attention to detail in the winery, and then just, you know, it's that wowee moment when it comes together.
And obviously James doesn't commentate or write about the Coldstream wines anymore, and that's a testament to his, I suppose, ethics in the industry. How north did the eyebrows go when he tasted this wine with you?
Sufficiently. It's, you know, I know there's often my colleague in crime, Greg Jarrett, often says that if he's sufficiently excited, the cobwebs will be cleaned off the ceiling. So it wasn't too far off. You know, I think, you know, it's just a great sense of joy. If he knows that his baby that he set up all those years ago is in good hands, and he loves just seeing the quality of the wines coming through, then that's enough reinforcement for certainly myself and the team.
So this vintage, 19, how would it compare to others? And Brad Kinnemoth, who's an old, great wine-loving colleague, has asked the context of this wine versus the 06, which he's got a bit of and is enjoying at the moment.
I could almost predict that question because Brad actually came in to select. He was spending some time at Coldstream Hills then and was lucky enough to go through all those barrels when we put the 2006 together. So I could be political and say, well, nothing could be as good as the 2006, Brad. But 2019 is pretty smart. I'd probably rate 2019 and 2018 are very close together in style. And probably 06, going back to 06, it was just a beautiful vintage. It was not incredibly warm, but it was just perfect for, you know, the likes of Pinot Chardonnay, but also for Cabernet Shiraz. It was just one of those dream vintages, a bit like 2000 as well. Great years.
I buy this tonight, Andrew, or tomorrow. I buy this. I drink a bit of it. What am I eating with it? And then what's it going to do in the next 10 to 15 years?
Okay. Well, what you'd eat with it, I think. Look, I think dishes that I've had with smoked salmon, it works a treat because it cuts through that oiliness of smoked salmon. Chicken dishes with the, you know, creamy sauces and things like that, because it's very much medium-bodied in style and has that acidity that cuts through any of those sort of richer dishes. So white meats, you know, poultry, seafood, but as I've seen with smoked salmon, it really works well. So what will it look like in 10 to 15 years' time? The colour will have deepened a little bit, not much, but you'll start to see, in some sense, how would you describe it? It's those toastier characters will start coming through, those secondary characters that come through with aging. The oak will just more or less meld into the wine. The fruit characters will still be there, but there are just all these, you know, essence of almost a creme brulee, those sort of things will come through as the wine ages. But it'll hold that fruit for a period of time, and then you'll start seeing these secondary notes come through.
Just got a question through, Andrew. What's your view on decanting with Chardonnays from the Yarra? You decant?
I wouldn't worry about it so much, although interestingly, I remember we had a project a number of years ago with Burgundian winemakers, and this Burgundian winemaker was we were never able to find out how, but he was able to get 2 barrels of Le Montrachet. And his view was always that the best glass of wine from that bottle was the morning after, which was always an interesting viewpoint. But I think a wine like that with power just has that opportunity to work with some air, and it really does open up to another dimension. I think, you know, look, I personally don't worry so much about decanting Chardonnay. I like just watching it evolve in the glass. The same can be said with Pinot, unless, you know, these wines have got notable sediment and so forth, where they obviously do need decanting. It's just good if you've got good glassware, you just see how those wines evolve. But like a lot of things, it's just a personal preference.
Okay, we moved to Pinot. We've got two, and we're sticking with the Deer Farm vineyard. And then great to have another reserve Pinot, which is a favourite of many of us on the call. So if we go back to Deer Farm, when it was planted, it was basically Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and that was all?
Pretty much. There's a little bit of Sauvignon Blanc and a bit of Merlot as well. So most of the Merlot's gone, probably because, cooler, wetter seasons just made it a bit more of a challenge. And, Pinot and Chardonnay seem to be doing well. If you look at what a lot of wine journalists are saying, the Upper Yarra does Pinot and Chardonnay particularly well. And also, in its various forms, i.e. sparkling. So, the beauty about Pinot from Gladysdale or from Deer Farm is that it just has this wonderful perfume from year to year. For those people that have seen a number of different vintages of this wine, a year like 2017, which was a cooler year, is much lighter in colour, more spice, very fragrant and very long in the mouth. Whereas 18 and 19, as I mentioned before, were warmer years, so the colours are a little deeper. More of those raspberry red fruits. There's still that element of spice, that sort of brambly note that comes through as well. But Pinot has to have that texture, so it has that silky edge to it. And the other thing also, that the young wines, of course, they will have that almost chalky tannin finish. I think one of the incredible things about Pinot is you look at it, and particularly, as an early introduction to the variety, if you think of Cabernet and Shiraz are the varieties that you'll put down, and if you want to, they will endure for a number of years in the cellar. But Pinot has this uncanny ability to be able to age for years and years for those people that want to do it. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to have seen some sort of 50, 60-year-old Pinots or Burgundies that have still been in incredible shape. Admittedly, they didn't look like this, but they still were very sound wines, and that has a lot to do with the tannin profile. So it is well, you can understand why it's a variety that draws you in, because it has all these attributes that really are to itself. Thin skins, lighter colour, but this incredible ability to have this wonderful perfume that comes out. I always think one of the great delights is seeing these young wines in barrel, and when all the muck has settled out in barrel and you get your first chance to see potentially what the vintage looks like, it's an amazing experience.
I love this wine. First time I've tried it tonight. Absolutely love it. And I think, it's interesting listening to you talk about warmer year. Like, again, this has got those aromatics and that real perfume nose that I love in Pinot Noir. It's delicate, it's refined, it's focused. Can it be any better than this? This is a pretty good wine, I think.
Oh, it's delicious. Yeah, the thing I love about Deer Farm Pinot is that you can drink it now quite easily. And you think of the sort of pairings of whether it be meat dishes, game dishes, duck, clearly. I remember at a dinner a couple of years ago, we had, there was a ravioli dish with a mushroom broth and goat's cheese, which was delicious as well too. I mean, this will go well with tuna, which is always an interesting one. You think of keeping them separate, but the oiliness in tuna and the sort of subtle characters that it has, it works particularly well with this. And, like a lot of these wines, it really is about that combination, working with food and the pairing with food. But I just love the way this just leaps out of the glass. You get those lovely sort of raspberries, muddled strawberries, wild strawberry notes. The oak's there, but it's very subtle. And then most years we'll just get this element of sort of graphite lead pencil note that comes through, which is probably largely attributed to the oak, but also just when we make this wine, most years it's just whole berries, so little marbles just going into the fermenter. The last year or so, with these warmer seasons, we've just put a little bit of whole bunch in there just to try and add some complexity to it as well, just have another dimension to the wine. And all that'll do is just give, it'll not necessarily firm up that structure, but it'll just give that little bit of a slight variant to previous vintages. So it's an evolution of Pinot as well for us.
I'm drinking this at Christmas time. That's one of my reds for Christmas lunch. I've just decided. Is it too good young? Is it gonna? Should I be putting a bit in the cellar, or is this one of those wines just drink it for the next couple of years and enjoy it?
I think you can do both. We had a year or so ago at one of our retail stores, we had a vertical lineup of Deer Farm Pinots going back to 2010, which was our first release. And it was great to see that, you know, that wine still shone. You know, you had that lovely sort of ethereal note coming through and perfume, and the vibrancy of the wine was still very much there as I would expect. So, you know, that was a wine that when we tried it was about 6, 7 or 8 years old. So it had some time in bottle, but it just really stood up well. And so that's why I would expect this wine, without a shadow of a doubt, to do exactly the same.
What's your view on chilling Pinot Noir? I've just been actually texted that question by somebody because they're not au fait with the Q&A. What's your view on texting Pinot Noir? Of chilling Pinot Noir?
Yeah, I think, I know in Queensland, you know, you've got a warm climate. I don't think it's such a bad thing, because if the wine is too hot in the glass, the first sensation you'll get is just alcohol, and you'll think, well, really, is that really what I'm looking for in the wine? So by all means, if you find that a little bit of chilling, and I don't think it's a bad thing, as long as you don't chill it too much, because if you chill it too much, then not only do you lose the aromatics, but also you find the acidity and the tannins just seem a little more enforced than say at the right serving temperature. So really, in a warmer climate, all you're trying to do is bring it down to ideally what we've got here as our serving temperature. But once again, it's a personal preference.
Would you make a rosé from the Yarra Valley?
If we had enough Pinot, I would. Yeah, we have tried it a couple of times as little pilot projects. And, you know, the success of rosé, you know, it's warranted. And, you know, there are people doing it very well in the Yarra. It's just, unfortunately, having access to the amount of fruit that you need it's not that easy.
Before we move to the reserve, I know there's lots of the wines that we're not talking about tonight, but I want to pick up on one in particular, which I've always liked, is the Esplanade. So we have a new vintage of that as well, don't we?
Yep. From the last vintage was 2017. There was no 2018 and 2019, and fingers crossed there'll be a 2020 as well. But the Esplanade is probably closer in style as a single vineyard to reserve. And that's because the vineyard is really only about 5 kilometres away from Coldstream Hills estate. So it's a little more muscular in style. In a lot of ways, when I describe it to people, it's kind of like the Shiraz drinkers Pinot, because the tannins are a little chunkier than particularly looking at, say, Deer Farm. Deer Farm's very supple and plush, whereas the Esplanade is a little more grunty and just needs time to settle down. But the story behind this, and apologies to anyone that's heard it before, but this is a grower's vineyard, and the vineyard manager is in the local Yarra Valley rock band, the Yeasty Boys. He's the drummer in the band, and they name all their blocks after well-known pubs of Melbourne, which unfortunately are all desolate at the moment, but they'll have their time in the sun again, hopefully. So the Esplanade bore its name from the Esplanade Hotel. And rather than calling it the grower's name and just G Block, we thought it was something a little more interesting. And in the same breath, that's why we've had another single vineyard over the years, the Doctor's Block, which is named after one of our growers who, unsurprisingly, is a doctor and comes in and gives us our flu jabs each year. But you know, I often think of our single vineyard wines as it's like a group of casuals that you hope turn up to work. Not every year you'll get them all, but some years, in the good years, hopefully most of them will turn up. So that's where we sit. Looks as though 2020 has been a pretty good year for our casuals, but the Espy is a really good contrast to that ethereal style of the Upper Yarra, and just gives people a choice. And you know, the team at Cellador, when it's open again, often are able to say that we will take you for a tour around the Yarra just by showing you these wines, and you don't need to go anywhere.
Is the difference between the lower and upper Yarra Valley in Pinot Noir as distinct as it is in Chardonnay?
Yes, I think so, because generally with Pinot, you'll find that the lower Yarra, or around Coldstream Hills, or going over to the northern side of the valley where, say, Dixon's Creek and so forth, you tend to find more of those cherry fruit flavours, sometimes verging into plum as well. Colours are generally darker as well, so they're more, robust is not the right word to describe Pinot, but you know what I mean? They're bigger wines than, say, the fragrant, elegant wines of the Upper Yarra. But that's the beauty of, say, our Coldstream Hills Yarra Valley Pinot, our entry level. It is a blend of vineyards from all around the Yarra, and that's where, you know, you get that element of fragrance and elegance, and at the same time you've got structure as well. And when you've got a source of vineyards to choose from, you get that consistency from year to year. Whereas, of course, single vineyards and reserves are very much dedicated to that one site, and you will see notable variations from year to year. The vintage really does speak to you.
So we move now to the reserve, 19. Tell us a little bit about what normally goes into this, and is it different this year to other years?
Okay, so this is a single block wine. Yeah, so typically we have, for anyone that's been to Coldstream Hills, there's the very famous vineyard called the Amphitheatre vineyard, because, you know, unsurprisingly, it's an amphitheatre which has different aspects. You've got north facing, easterly, westerly facing, and so forth. As well as another vineyard that's just on the other side of the driveway. And this is what's gone into making this wine. So reserve for us is typically, as I mentioned about the Esplanade before, it's that grainier, earthier notes. It's got slightly chewier tannins, because this wine will definitely age for, you know, 10 to 20 years. As mentioned before, James loves the 92 Reserve Pinot. It's a ripping wine. Do we make the wine any differently? Not really. It has an element of whole bunches, anywhere up to about 20% whole bunches, whereas, say, Deer Farm from that cooler site will generally have very small amounts up to maybe 5% or thereabouts. And Esplanade, being closer in style to Reserve, will generally have 15 to 20% whole bunches as well.
Andrew, just pause for a minute. What does whole bunch give you?
Whole bunch, it generally gives sometimes this sort of spicy, I often call it a sandalwoody sort of character that comes through. We used to do trials at the winery where if you made a wine that was 100% whole bunch, if you do it too far, it can almost taste like potato peelings, which is hardly an endorsement for a wine. But as a blending tool, it's really quite interesting, and you get, you know, all these sandalwoody, spicy notes that come off as well, five spice, all that sort of stuff. So it's just trying to do a balanced fermentation, because I know James was always very keen, you know, to have sort of 20% whole bunch, because for a number of years we toned right back on that, and he'd look and say, oh, you know, those bastards, they're changing the technique and style. But I think it was just respecting what the vineyards were delivering, and I think it works pretty well. So typically for, as I said, for Reserve Pinot, it's about structure, flavour. You know, you'll see the dark cherry notes that come through, almost in a strange sort of way, you know, red, black jelly beans. You'll get those characters that come through, but it just has, as I mentioned before, this innate ability to age particularly well. there's always an edge of earthiness that comes through, hints of graphite, but it's about structure, but at the same time respecting the variety that it is Pinot. It has to have that sense of plushness. It can't look like a dry red where it's just more angular and so forth. It really has to respect the variety, have those layers of flavour. And I always think when you see these wines just evolve in the glass, that's super important. And one of the key things I like is if there's just a drop left in the glass, just smell that drop. And if it smells of just vibrant fruit characters, to me, that's always a sign that it has a long way to go. It has real vibrancy and freshness and pizzazz and power.
So if I look at this wine versus the Deer Farm, I'm enjoying the Deer Farm maybe now. What's the reserve going to do with a few years in the cellar?
You'll probably get more of those earthier notes coming through. And as the wine gets, quite old, you'll see those truffly notes coming through. Very much earthy, truffly. When people talk about forest floor, I think you'll see elements of that. And part of that may even be due to the whole bunches that were used initially as well. The wine will still hold its structure, but of course, with an aged wine, you'll see the tannins drop off a lot, and that may mean that the wine needs decanting, depending on how old it is. But you'll just see this gradual progression of the primary fruits, which is what you see now, those cherries, strawberries, those jelly bean characters that I mentioned. They'll just gradually ease into the wine. Oak will be there, but really quite subtle, and you'll just get those secondary notes that come through. So once again, it's very much a personal preference as to how you want to drink these wines. I know there has been strong interest from some of the markets around the world looking for aged wines. And then, of course, you look in Australia, there are a lot of wines that are purchased within 24 hours of buying them. So we're kind of lucky that we've got each way bets here, if you like.
Yeah. Peter sent through a question, obviously reading tasting notes about the 19 reserve wines being harvested in late February. What's the latest that you've ever harvested the reserve wines, and what's your view on vintage timings when they start and finish? Is it changed over the last 20 years that you've been there?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a good example of that. That one of the blocks that normally goes into Coldstream Hills Reserve Pinot is, and it'll be very much a feature of the 2020 Reserve, which I'm confident. We picked that in 2002. Admittedly, it was an incredibly cold vintage. I think it was the coldest vintage since records began. That was my first vintage at Coldstream Hills, and we were twiddling our thumbs until I think it was the 19th or 20th of March before we actually picked that block. And then fast forward, almost 20 years, and it's not uncommon to have picked that block in, say, the 15th or 18th of February. So that really is coming quite a long way forward. And I always remember back to 2006. To me, I'm not sure what happened, but there was a noticeable shift in things just being pushed forward because nobody had barrels at that, just prior to the 2006 vintage. And suddenly we realised that everything was ready. And so there was this mad scramble and panic just to try and get our suppliers to get these barrels to us as quickly as possible. And ever since then, we've always been on the forefront to make sure that we get barrels in and we're actually ready to go. And what does that mean? It means those warmer seasons, really quite compressed seasons. So 2019 was just this tsunami that appeared. And that's hard work because you need to get that fruit in at the time when you believe there's the optimum of flavour, acid and so forth, because the last thing you want are big alcoholic flabby wines. It's not in our remit. So that's really one of the challenges. So you may decide that in some instances you have to go a little earlier on some parcels of fruit just to ensure that the good stuff, everything that comes in is good stuff for us, but you really have to ensure that we try and get the best out of the vintage. So, from a practical level, if you've got a certain number of fermenters for reds, you either need to buy more fermenters or have less fruit go through, or you've got to somehow spread the vintage out. And that's one of the real dilemmas that not only ourselves, but a lot of producers, really have to think hard and fast about what to do, because buying equipment that sits around for 10 months of the year doing nothing is a pretty expensive way to make wine.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, but I'm excited that this year you've got a reserve Cabernet, and you mentioned Bailey earlier. It's a variety that we don't often talk enough about for the Yarra Valley, but you've got a 2018 reserve Cabernet as part of this year's release. How good is it?
It's pretty smart, actually. 18's it's a warm year, so you'd normally think warm years equals good for late maturing varieties. It's what the Yarra Valley delivers really well. It has so much history in the Yarra Valley, going right back to the beginning with Yeringberg and De Pury, and obviously
De Castella.
What's that?
St Hubert's with Cabernet.
St Hubert's, yeah. I've just had a complete mental block. Enormous pedigree there, and very much the medium-bodied claret styles, and I think that's something that sometimes we forget about. There are some bigger Cabernets that are produced. Clearly Margaret River's doing wonderful things with Cabernet. That's a plug to those guys. But the Yarra Valley has done particularly well, albeit in a small way. Medium-bodied, those slight leafy blackcurrant, blackberry notes that come through. But getting the fruit ripe, that's the main thing that's required. If you don't get it ripe, you end up with hard tannins, high acidity, and not getting the flavours that you're looking for. There's not a huge amount of Cabernet growing in the Yarra Valley at the moment, so it really is quite a hard resource to find. Someone's
just emailed in the Q&A very quickly about the 04 reserve Cabernet. How does the 18 compare to that?
04, I think, is a fabulous vintage. 04 was a year that yielded lots, so that was always a worry. Were we going to end up with dilute wines? But it was just the perfect ripening season. It was just mild to warm conditions the whole way through, and there was no rush to get things in. So I haven't had 04 for a little while, but it would be 04 and 18. 04 was probably a little cooler than 18, but it would still have very much that, it's the same vineyard. Nothing's really changed there. So there will be that thread that goes through those two wines. 04 would clearly show more of those earthy, developed characters that you would expect to see. But there would be similarities. I think the likes of 04, 06 are probably similar. And then, even the likes of, we had a really long gap before it was almost 10 years without a reserve Cabernet. It was just great to see it coming back after, a lot of work that was done to the vineyards. And hopefully now we'll see, a bit more continuity from vintage to vintage.
That's why I'm excited. There has been a gap, and I urge all Cabernet lovers to not ignore the Yarra for Cabernet. Andrew, as always with you, brilliant. An hour goes like that. I urge all of our viewers who are Coldstream Hills lovers, thank you for supporting Coldstream. When the cellar door reopens, hopefully in the next few weeks, if you can travel there, pop up and you can try all the new release wines. But obviously, as we go into next year, we'll get Andrew to visit all of our states again and connect with our with our Amphitheatre members. Andrew, if there was one wine out of this year's release that I should buy, what would you say it is?
Well, I think you've already answered it, George. You've got Deer Farm Pinot for Christmas, haven't you?
Yeah.
Sorted.
Oh, that's beautiful. Absolutely.
And a little bit of sparkling on the side.
Yeah, British sparkling on the side. All right, beautiful. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you to all of us for joining in, and stay safe. Enjoy the great wines from Coldstream Hills, and hopefully we'll see you in person soon. If not, please visit us in the Yarra Valley when the cellar door opens. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, George. Thanks, everybody. Good night.